Hey everyone, this week we're getting back to the Porsche 914 barn find. We have a small checklist today which includes primering the outer rocker, installing the door sills and door jambs, welding the joints and buffing them smooth, and priming the exposed steel. We're going to need a few tools like a grinder, flap disc, welder, welding shield, electric sander, priming paint, and a cover sheet. This is where we left off with our repairs. We're exposed bare steel that needs to be primed before we move further with any other repairs. So let's get that cover sheet in place that I mentioned. This is mostly to protect the interior from getting any overspray on it. The primer that I'm using is just a primer that was sitting around in my cabinet. Once all the body work on the car is complete, the entire car will get what they call a high build primer. The high build primer gives you a bit of forgiveness on areas you may have missed or gaps that may need to be filled. First item, check. With the primer complete, we can start installing our new door sill and our old door jambs. The door jambs are going to be challenging to install due to their location. It'll be hard to weld and grind in their many curves. I'm using a wire wheel to try and remove most of the paint off of the joints I'm about to weld. The wire wheel doesn't take any of the steel away and allows for a smoother finish. I also like using a battery powered grinder. You have a lot more control versus an electric grinder. It's always good to test fit your piece before it goes back in. The piece needs to go in exactly how it came out, so that includes putting the disc back in the areas where you had to cut the steel out. But sometimes you just need a little extra hand to get it back in place. The MIG welder I'm using is a $100 MIG welder that I purchased from a local hardware store. It's a really great welder. I prefer using TIG welding on any structural, but on body panels like this is the welder to use. The Bondo that I'm grinding off here is actually about 3/8 of an inch thick. It's a lot thicker than I thought when we did our magnet test in the beginning. This rear piece you see me putting back on here, this is going to be the most crucial piece when closing the door. So when we're doing these tack welds, we need to make sure that they're in the proper place. After we're done these tack welds, we're going to have to put the door on and make sure that it closes properly. Even then, it's going to be hard to do because that whole side that you see that is rotted, we're going to have to rebuild that at a later date. We might just leave that not welded for now. We'll just leave the tack welds on. This is Restoration Design's door sill. It fit great after I put the door sill supports on and did all the appropriate drilling. Here I am using the self-tappers that I like to use to mount my panels. The door closed really well after a lot of adjustment, and you didn't have to slam it in order for it to fully close. Now the more difficult piece is this piece that I'm cutting out now. It's a triangle that's going to need to have a little bit of a curvature in it. Should be interesting to wield. I'm using a piece of paper to scribe the lines of the triangle that we're going to need to install. I usually cut the piece a little bit bigger so that afterwards we can trim it off if we need to make adjustments. It's a lot harder to add metal than to take metal away. A little bit of hammer wielding, a little bit of tack welds, and there's the rear. The front, same thing. I used a piece of paper, I scribed the lines that I needed, I cut the piece, trimmed anything I needed, tack welded it in, and got ready for my final welds. Which brings us to our next item. Check. It's hard to tell with the speed of the video, but I'm actually using a technique called stitch welding. The stitch welding just stops warping from happening by keeping the metal a little more cool as we go. There it is, all polished out from our buffing discs. The buffing discs are 80 grit. They're flap discs, flat sand flap discs. I drilled holes in the sill plate that are 1/4 inch thick. I put self-tappers in every other hole and welded the holes in between. The reason why I did it like this was so that the heat would be dispersed out evenly to avoid warping again. Stitch welding the rear was a little more difficult because there's a rubber membrane that's on the other side of the steel on the inside. So as I'm welding, it had the tendency to want to catch fire. Speaking of fire, I did actually catch the car on fire. You'll see in the next second or so that I had to use my homemade extinguisher. You can see in the hole at the bottom there, when the welder's off, you can see the flame still going. With a bit of an extinguisher. It does take some talent to weld these up and to be able to blend the steel so that all you need is spot putty filler after. But all in all, the flap discs really help. They allow you to not take too much steel out as you're grinding, and you can do a nice smooth finish. Take your time and buff it out. Once you have it to a certain point that you are satisfied, I just use some 80 grit sandpaper on an electric sander just to take out all the little swirls that you might see that are extra, and gets it ready for primer. Our next item, check. The objective of using this low grade primer is just to cover the steel so that it doesn't start oxidizing, causing rust. As I mentioned, once the car is ready for its final primer, everything will be resanded. Any spots that need spot filler will be filled and completed. Speaking of completion, last item, check.